Now, historically, I think we're all familiar with the fact that stress and its effects have been reported in a innumerable number of ways, which are quite similar to what we experience in modern society, both in terms of fatigue, tiredness, need for sleep, and all that. And many of the challenging public health concerns have been linked in numerous ways to the effects of stress itself. And this has happened both in terms of a contributing factor, both in the initiation of stress related or lifestyle disorders, as well as the course of a certain condition or an illness itself. We also have evidence from functions of immune systems and malfunctioning, which suggests that stress could be playing a very important role here. Now, whenever we look at definitions of stress, we often come up with many confusing definitions, and so we do look at definitions that are more easy to understand from what is happening within an individual. But we must understand that some of these concepts of early definitions of stress have been borrowed from the field of physics to describe what really happens when there is a wear and tear on the system. So the most popular definitions of stress, and I think in most textbooks, is that given by Lazarus and Folkman. And they look at stress as a particular relationship between the person and the environment. And so the relationship is very essential here. The other important thing that it is appraised by the person as stressful or taxing or exceeding a person's resources. So it's not that it's always taxing or exceeding, but when it is appraised as such, and in a way it endangers the person's well-being. Now, how do we look at different models? I think you've already had a session on the biological model, so I won't go into that. But we do know in the immediate response to stress, it's very important to understand what really happens in phases. And more recent work has looked at what happens if this wear and tear continues in the absence of actual threats, and how a person would be having difficulties in terms of sleep and so on, and what happens to the system in general. Now, closer to home are the transactional models, which focus, like I said, on appraisal or interpretations of events. And this is where a lot of the literature on coping responses and how to develop coping responses becomes relevant to us. The evolutionary models, which have largely looked at similarities across different species, talks about how there is a general response from the nervous system, and in a way also talks about the adaptive responses, the adaptive nature of some responses to stress. Now let's look at some of the manifestations, and I think this is familiar to all of us, so I won't go into too many of these details. But you might find that this also is echoed in many of the emotional disorders that we see in our clinics, and we may see varying manifestations of either anxiety, depression, burnout in caregivers, a lot of behavioral manifestations, and of course, uses of substances, which could be a result of reactions to stress or in ways of coping to stress. Now, when we focus on stress as a stimuli, we try and look at what is the time frame to understand stressors. And so stressors can be varied in terms of their time frame, right from acute, time-limited situations like a visit to a dentist or a doctor where you're expecting something unpleasant to happen. So it's a very time-limited thing, but doesn't last for after the event is over. A lot of life events have been historically categorized as stressor sequences, particularly those that are perceived as negative in terms of bereavement, divorce, and so on. And to some extent, some positive life events also, which a person is not very adequately equipped to handle. Chronic intermittent stressors are the focus in a lot of interventions, for example, like stress inoculation interventions, where we know that some stressors keep occurring in our different phases of our life, for example, meetings that we're not prepared for or unpleasant examinations and so on. But there is a certain time limit for this also. Chronic stressors are of interest, particularly when there is no time limit for the stressor. At the same time, there's a lot of burden placed on the individual. And I think we're all familiar with daily hassles, which are more to do with environmental and other factors. Now, what are sources of stress? And a lot of work has gone into understanding everyday sources. And here I would like to put in choices, including lifestyles in the current day, where you have a lot of focus on behavioral addictions and a lot of other behavior changes that have actually imposed stressful situations on individuals. A lot of our society is also facing unpredictability and lack of control over various factors within the environment, and of course for being different both individually and otherwise. Stress in the workplace I've brought in as relevant because a lot of us spend a large number of our time at workplace, and both the context and the context of content of work is very relevant here. We look at factors like pay, hours of work, organization culture, how much decision latitude we have in terms of making decisions at work, and of course interpersonal relationships. And lastly, where certain things are of intense nature, we have looked at post-traumatic stress disorder. I think this is something that Dr. Deepak would have gone through in the last week. What I'd like to emphasize on this slide is the fact that in this whole mechanism, psychological stressors have been found to be the most potent, and they involve a lot of higher order processing, which again comes from transaction theories in terms of how we perceive and interpret such stressful situations. This also allows for a lot of individual differences in stress responses. The flight or fight response is something that, again, I would like to emphasize because the other points would have been discussed in detail. Now, when it's in the short run, it is perceived to be adaptive. However, a lot happens in the current age that may not be really in the short run, and the response to stress, as we've seen in Selye's model, may continue much beyond the actual experience of the stress itself, and therefore the wear and tear is what we are looking at as important. And therefore, we come to the concept of allostasis, both in stress and health. And this concept has been spoken about at great length in medical conditions, in the development of disorders like cardiovascular diseases and various other conditions where there is a continued wear and tear despite the stressor having gone away, and a person develops a way of dealing with a stressful situation. So while there are initial adaptive changes, both from the neurochemical as well as hormonal perspectives, when this persists, there could be a detrimental effect. The magnitude and duration of stress, of course, is something that changes throughout lifespan, and therefore not looking at stress as being the same in an individual who's younger at age and older or in the later years of life would be very essential. Now, in terms of the allostatic overload, we've talked about chronic elevation, and we also know that some occupational settings or some persons in certain occupational fields are likely to be more at risk. There are also personality factors that may predispose individuals to experience more of this wear and tear and eventually leading to disorders. One must also understand that this could be an indirect impact also, and a combination of factors could be operating. So there is, of course, a diathesis present. There is also a stressor that is important at how the two of them interact. Now, this turning off responses when it is no longer required is probably one of the focuses in management as well. Now, this is a newer concept in terms of, I think we're using this term a lot in being stressed out, in terms of a lifestyle itself of being stressed out. And again, we're referring to a complexity of responses that might often be grouped together. Now, in this context of stress and health and the allostatic load, people have also looked at what impact it has on certain lifestyles and how that in turn leads to stress-related disorders. For example, sleep deprivation and the kind of changes it can have on hormonal changes and how that can lead to obesity and so on. And so there's a host of factors that we really need to be looking at when we talk about a stressful condition or being stressed out itself. We're not talking about single factors, but in fact mediating factors that are very important to us. Continuing on the individual differences in stress and stress responses, stress responsivity, both in terms of individual variations. For example, an individual's levels of arousability, which is something that's very unique to an individual, might vary from person to person, and therefore different people being exposed to levels of stress might vary in their response to the same situation. Now we know that psychosocial environments that we're all in are highly competitive. They're also rapidly changing, and therefore we need to keep adapting to situations. So while there are various diatheses that we are already coming in with, the reverse is not possible. That we can't really change the genetic factors. We really have to see how we adapt to psychosocial environments to make it less difficult for us. From the, I think, pharmacological perspective, biological perspective, you would have discussed lifestyle disorders and the impact of stress on various health conditions. We also have to see how interventions focus on the response of individuals to threats and stress. Again, this is something that that would have been talked about, but I would like to look at the prolonged release of stress hormones as being a genetic vulnerability in some individuals as well. Now, of interest to us would be factors that actually buffer or increase stress, and this is something that is sometimes within our control and sometimes not quite within our control. Two things that in literature have been often spoken about are social support and networks and social integration. And social support and network has to be discussed in two ways. One is the perceived availability of social support. How many individuals do I have perceive as being available when I need help? And what is the availability? How accessible are they in terms of providing support? There is a distribution which is unequal a lot of times in terms of health resources, and therefore in this context socioeconomic factors become very important in terms of either access because of financial reasons, access because of geographical factors, and they also impact on the experience of stress. And this is often talked about even in accessing help for physical health conditions. A very important factor here is how effective are the various coping strategies. What is an individual's availability of resources and abilities that is already present. And this is essential when we talk about how some individuals in the face of stress continue to be able to carry on and deal with situations while some individuals are not able to do that. A lot of this evidence from Cohen study and other studies come from patients who have been recovering from diverse types of illnesses. So we have evidence from people who require a lesser number of days of hospitalization or fewer number of days in terms of recovery itself. This is a topic that was researched extensively in the 80s, and we do talk about stages of burnout, but unfortunately the concept did not gain much attention except in popular literature. We do know that there are some types of personalities who are more likely or more susceptible to experiencing burnout, and they are those individuals who are more adaptable, they have low self-reliance and therefore probably dependent on others, sensitive and subject to feelings of guilt. And I think in this context, burnout has been studied a lot in the context of caregiving as well, and you find that some of these personality types might be quite present. I'm coming now to a concept of coping. I'm not going to go into too many details of coping. Perhaps if there are questions, we can take it up. But just to give you a definition of coping, again, a fairly well-quoted definition of coping. What is to be emphasized is the combination of cognitive and behavioral efforts. So it's not any one, but a combination of different types of strategies that are most effective. This is a easy to understand classification of coping strategies, and you'll find that both adaptive and maladaptive strategies can be part of the coping strategies. And so we don't need to, when we are intervening or training in coping strategies, we don't necessarily need to focus on just one or the other. It could be enhancing one, reducing the other, or using a combination of coping strategies. A more recent look at coping has been in the direction of proactive coping. What we know in our sayings of a stitch in time saves 9. The only downside of it being that proactive people who use excessive proactive coping could be worriers also, where they're constantly anticipating problems and trouble, and those troubles might never actually come. So here we come to the components, and I'm looking at very, very broad components of stress management, keeping the time in mind also. And you'll find that a lot of interventions for resilience and the components of resilience itself overlap with the stress management features. So we have the awareness of self as being unique or common to a lot of these stress management interventions. Many of them focus on arousal reduction, presuming that that would also help in bringing down thresholds for stress, as well as in modifying immediate responses to stress, modifying appraisals either through reframing, positive reframing, or even looking at cognitive reappraisals, and both time management and problem solving as being largely preventive in nature so that future stressful episodes don't become too frequent. Now let's look at resilience in the context of stress. I've tried to put it in the context of stress rather than look at them as two separate things. I won't go into definitions unless somebody has specific questions on the textbook definitions of resilience. A lot of this impact or a rebound from adversity is what has been talked about in the context of resilience. And it's been looked at more as a construct in the context of recovery and adaptation, more in terms of adaptation than just recovery. Now, these are the 3 R's that have been spoken about, and I've mentioned that resilience is more a process than an outcome, and therefore it appears sometimes as a misnomer when you say I'm going to train somebody in resilience or I'm doing resilience training, because we also look at the fact that there are some characteristics of individuals who are more resilient. So when we look at the stages, one is moving from being resilient to resisting and finally recovery in the context of illness. This is a busy slide, but I'd just like to talk about it in a little more detail in the coming ones. These are some concepts that have been discussed in the combination of stress and resilience. One is the role of emotion regulation. The other is how to build or how to look at self-efficacy and resilience. What about resilience in special populations? For example, people who've been exposed to trauma, who've had difficult adverse situations like poverty or mental health conditions. And what are our goals when we are trying to promote resilience? Quickly look at some of the characteristics, and this might sort of echo from what we've looked at in terms of who are these individuals who are resilient, plus who manage stress well. One is a capacity for positive personal development in a variety of domains. So they're not in any one rigid domain, but they're able to look at things across various areas of life and spheres. They have good relationships with others, therefore the social support and networks are adequate. They're also able to manage and self-management of emotions and understand those of others well. Adequate communication skills, which again is important to be integrated in society as well as to harness social support. Problem solving and decision making, taking adequate responsibility but not self-blame for one's actions, and to be able to set rewarding, realistic goals so that it sort of acts as a motivation to carry on. So coming back to what are various factors that help in resilience, or what are factors associated with it. One is, of course, a lot of now work talks about emotion regulation. It's the buzzword in terms of therapies and management. The concept of emotion regulation is more a skill, but it's also looked at as a mediator in the context of how one adjusts to stress. We also look at what happens when there is stress exposure, and we know that with stress exposure there is a lot of emotional dysregulation that occurs, which in turn leads to negative outcomes. So in the model, we are actually looking at how to enhance skills in emotion regulation. So specifically, there are 2 kinds of emotion regulation strategies that have been very widely researched in the context of stress and resilience. One is attentional control, which is more to do with whether you're attending to a negative stimuli. For example, rumination has been talked about in detail in the context of attentional control. So people who have typical response styles of brooding, looking at a particular negative aspect of an event, might be lower in resilience, but also predisposed to emotional disorders like depression. Cognitive reappraisal, in fact, has been talked about in terms of how to upregulate or enhance certain mood states, and this might be done by using reframing the situation by trying to reduce and then therefore reducing its emotional impact. So reappraisal is more focused on how to look at the situation very differently and sort of bring down its impact, whereas attentional control might actually be to change the deployment, to change the attention to something that either is distracting or focus so much on it that it actually dampens one's mood. And so both of them in a way impact the experience of emotions. Another closely linked theory, of course, is that of the transactional theory of stress. But here I'm looking at the social cognitive perspective, which is also very closely linked to self-regulation. The self-regulatory aspect of the individual dealing with stressful situation also helps in bringing down the impact of the stress itself, and also leads to successful adaptation. Important here is what Bandura spoke about a long time ago when he was discussing the theory of social cognition, and that is to do with self-efficacy. So how much do I have a confidence over myself in being able to carry out certain behaviors, and that goes a long way in various health conditions, whether you're looking at managing a chronic life condition or a medical condition. I think it's important to look at how to increase or enhance these self-efficacy beliefs. This includes, and how does self-efficacy belief develop? One is the interactive feedback between the person and the environment, which is crucial to this model. Also, our success and failure experiences with our own behaviors and in terms of mastery experiences that we've had. Both of these have been looked at as a trait-like factor. So it's also a possibility that some individuals are better equipped to cope with stressful situations and therefore perceived as more resilient as well. I have briefly touched upon social support, but social support as a buffer to stress is very essential for us, and where individuals may be lacking in communication skills or have a difficulty because of their environmental conditions in building social support, I think interventions would be very essential at this point. It also acts as a protective factor in times of adversity, and we all know that our families form an important part both in reaching out for help and also in the recovery from various difficult situations. A lot of work comes from chronic illnesses. Social integration is more a sociological concept, but has both behavioral and cognitive components, and how actively one engages in efforts to be part of a larger social fabric is very essential here. Much of the work has been traced back to Durkheim, who's spoken on the different types of suicide as well as social conditions which lead a person to suicide. But in the context of resilience and stress and resilience, we need to understand that stable social structures and norms that are provided to us are very protective because they also define how some of our behaviors are. They also help us in understanding what are these relationships that we have, what frequency of contacts does a person have, and how does an individual identify with others and perceive a stable structure. So in the absence of a stable social structure, breaking down or reacting adversely to difficult situations might be more common. Coming to a closer to home topic in terms of resilience and mental health or mental illness, a concept that's very close to all of us is recovery. And recovery has been variously defined. I've taken one definition of recovery which talks about building new purposes or developing new meaning in one's life or a purpose in one's life. And that has to go beyond the catastrophic effects of mental illness. So it's also difficult to study construct, both in terms of a process as well as a way of life. But what's very important is in terms of methodology and understanding recovery is to look at subjective experiences as well as the aspect of adaptation and psychological function. A lot of research has looked at common recovery themes, which is hope and optimism, self-respect, self-determination, as well as openness to discovery and new experiences. Again, these are concepts linked to personality itself. We also know that it is an ability to bounce back from adversity or trauma, and also looked at in the concept of in the areas of where people have faced extreme situations and yet come back to talk to us about success stories and see how they've actually recovered and come up with new meanings in life. It might also provide individuals newer insights or strengths, and people might even report better or improved functioning from time before the trauma. Now, the last segment of this talk is going to be on interventions to improve resilience. While we talk about interventions to improve stress, I think we're more comfortable because we know it's a time-limited situation sometimes, and we have very known strategies that we can use borrowed from the framework of cognitive behavior therapy. But when it comes to improving resilience, there's a lot of debate about how to actually improve something that is sometimes discussed as a trait or as a process. So one is the questions that come to our mind is what are the aims of these interventions to build resilience? When do we time them? Because is it after a certain condition or before? If we are presuming that a person is already resilient, what do we do? And what would be our targets for intervention? And many of them have focused on either directing it at the individual, families which need to be more resilient, is it the organization or communities in the face of disaster or difficulties? So I've looked at literature which speaks about three broad interventions that have caught up with some research. One is the hardiness training, and the word hardiness again comes from the literature on personality. The other is psychoeducational resilience enhancement training. The third, of course, is stress inoculation training. A lot of us will be familiar with Meichenbaum's work. And the fourth, which I have taken the liberty of adding, is emotion regulation therapy. So from what I could understand, hardiness training involves a lot of overlap with other intervention strategies, and one must look at some of these with caution because there's not too much literature on it in terms of efficacy and so on. But they do look at exercises which look at commitment, look at control over a stressor, and also look at building social support and social skills. And therefore, I think they look at building social networks as one of the goals. The second intervention that has been researched has been largely for youth, particularly college-going youth, and this has focused on building coping skills in the face of stress. So one could argue that they could also be building resources to deal with upcoming stressors or life stressors. Meichenbaum stress inoculation training, I think everybody would be very familiar with in our learning years. Initially developed to manage anxiety and stress, but the three phases are actually preparatory in nature, the last one going into application. And a lot of them have been applied effectively to future or anticipatory situations, whether it's the police or it's a student going for an exam or an individual preparing for, let's say, a surgery. A lot of these can be future oriented, and the emphasis is on coping skills and the application of these coping skills. So the intervention strategies themselves may be very similar to what we see in cognitive behavioral therapy in terms of problem solving, relaxation, and so on. The last set, which, like I said, I have taken the liberty of adding, and I think you'll be hearing more about this in subsequent sessions, is that of emotion regulation therapy. I would just stop to say that it is a combination of various cognitive behavioral methods, but emphasis being on acceptance and mindfulness based or experiential strategies, and focus more on enhancing regulatory skills, which are very essential in managing and understanding and managing emotional states, not letting it get out of hand, at the same time not denying it also. And therefore, cognitive distancing and reframing become very important, and not suppressing or avoiding them. I think you have a session coming up, and would just suffice to say that part of emotion regulation therapy comes from the use of various mindfulness-based strategies, and therefore the concepts of distancing and decentering and taking a more balanced view is very essential here. And we have a lot of literature coming from the field of affective neuroscience, which supports the regulation of emotions using some of these strategies. So what do they actually do? They raise awareness and focus. They focus on present moment. And a lot of this could be future oriented also. It is not necessarily only when there is a stressful situation. It also improves objectivity. And there is definitely a focus on thoughts and emotions in a balanced way. The components of mindfulness you will see are very similar to the components of stress management, but different in a way that it looks at not challenging or debating, but also in a way of accepting oneself and the situation in a very non-critical, non-judgmental way. And therefore, the levels of self-criticality decreases, compassion to self increases, and therefore one is more likely to experience changes in mood as well. So I would like to conclude here with a few points that might just sum up what I've been talking about. Despite so many years of stress and resilience, you'll still find a lot of books coming up, a lot of literature on stress and resilience. Therefore, it continues to interest researchers over the years. They are important both in understanding vulnerability to illness, so it depends on which side you're looking at it, both in terms of vulnerability as well as recovery. Factors that impact these two processes are both psychological, and we must not forget the social fabric in which stress and stress experience occurs. And interventions have had a significant degree of overlap in terms of not just building individual skills, but in seeing how these individual skills improve networks and increase flexibility at large. These are some of the references that I've looked at, and they're review articles as well as textbooks, which you could probably look at both for resilience and stress and social support.
Thank you, Dr. Poulami. That was a comprehensive presentation of the overview of stress and resilience as such. Now, the topic is open for discussion. Any clarification suggestions any questions, you can unmute yourself and you can ask the questions.
We can add on also.
Yeah,
You can, I know I can see a lot of clinical psychologists sitting in the audiences. So you can definitely add on your experience and which of the method Dr. Pauline was speaking, you feel that probably adaptable and useful in our population, or we have expertise on those things. Can I start from here, otherwise?
Any questions in house? Okay. This is Swati. I would like to know if there are any specific strategies to increase resilience among cervical cancer patients.
I think that's a very, very specific question. So it's always sort of challenging to answer something very specific. I would probably look at what are the aims or targets for this particular clinical population. To my mind, any of these strategies could be effective provided you're matching the intervention to the client. So I've given you a very broad overview, but I'm sure they're applicable to patients across different clinical conditions, not necessarily subtypes of either cancer or any other disorder. So they should work.
Yeah,
and if you're looking at acceptance, if you're also looking at enhancing self-efficacy beliefs, depends on what if your target is to enhance treatment adherence, and I would look at self-efficacy beliefs. If you're looking at a stage of illness that is much more advanced, then acceptance would be more important. Or if you're looking at pain management, then again some of the stress reduction strategies would be important. So you really have to see targets and matching interventions. You have a host of strategies, you can choose from them.
You can ask Dr. Swati, I mean, if she has any suggestion or experience in working in the cervical cancer.
Swati, can you unmute yourself and discuss with us about your experience in the aspects of psycho-oncology field as such?
So that it will be
useful for all of us also, like, because that's not a common area which we are working on.
Next two questions.
There's another question from Dr. Kalol Roy.
Kalol, you can unmute and go ahead. You don't have to.
Can you please unmute yourself and ask?
Yes. I would like to know, are life skills ideal for effective intervention for adolescent stress? Would they really cause an effectiveness if we give a training to them?
They are universal programs, and many of these individuals maybe not at that point facing stress, but there is evidence to show that it equips people. Like I said, the stress inoculation training also might be something that builds skills that can be used at a later point in time. So it's important to be equipped with skills. You may or may not use them all the time, but yes, it is important to have. And if you look at the component of life skills, a lot of them are to do with managing relationships, managing emotions, managing oneself, and at ages which are very, including refusal skills, assertiveness, they are preparing the individual for potential stressors or challenging situations, and therefore would be important for that age.
And just to announce, Kalol, we have actually trying to start a life skill program in between. Thinking next month, probably in the August, I think around August or September, we want an adolescent, adolescent program, and that time we will ask one of our colleague, Dr. Sikala. She works in life skill education, and she's pioneer in this area. So we'll probably put that thing to her, and she's, I think, definitely. I think the very important point. Life skill is one area which we need to, work in that. Let's see, August or September we'll have program.
One addition to that. In terms of stress interventions, there are two kind of theories about how stress progresses over time. One is that when stress occurs early, especially early in life, that whatever happens, and then there's not much that can be done if the intervention isn't given at a particular time-limited crucial period. But there are, of course, other literature and other scientific evidence which points to stress actually causing a sequence of events which tends to continue to occur over time, especially with chronic stress. And in those situations, intervention at any point of time could make a difference. But perhaps the take-home lesson from that would be that while life skills may not particularly help the person at that particular point, it might serve as a some kind of inoculation for future stress. So a life skill intervention may actually, though it may not have an immediate effect, it's important to remember that it may have an effect over time which is disproportionate.
Good.
Look, Swati has said that she's unable to contact because her audio things are not working. She's introduced herself as she's pursuing her PhD in psychology in cervical cancer patients.
But then I think Swati, next time you come, it's nice to share your experience because our it will enrich all of us. I mean, we all work in various areas, so let's see next time you get a mic and share your experiences. It's a very unique area, doing a PhD in life sciences.
Any other questions? The one question is current evidence for religious practices and spirituality in resilience, spiritual fitness or spirituality question. Could we measure this?
To my knowledge, yes. It is not current. It has been there for a long time, I think. And even at NIMHANS, I think there are studies on religious coping methods in caregivers. They published literature on religious coping. So it is something that has been in practice for many years now. It is just that I think as therapists, we don't prescribe religious coping if somebody is not already using it. But if somebody is using it and it is helpful, then one would continue to use it. So the question of its effectiveness, the coping effectiveness is always something that we need to look at, and not in the face of not dealing with other strategies or not dealing with stress in general. So we look at what kind of stressor, how effective it is, and yes, there are measures to look at spirituality and others. In the reference that I've given on resilience, you will find that there is a whole section on spirituality and religious factors and how resilience is very essential together with it. You might find that useful also.
Yeah, I think I can share experience of late when I see in my clinics. In my clinics, normally, if I in assessment if find a person is religious or spirituality, and it's culturally acceptable, I certainly promote it. Because as I told you, there is nothing as a quantification of therapy in religiosity. But often people accept it without putting a blend to other things. And I have really a couple of patients which we have rented here, and they're doing extremely well. But some tips here and there, like electric therapy, and I think it's a good way to promote.
Yeah, spirituality forms a part of the multidimensional work with any chronic non-communicable disorders as such. There's another question. Is there any specific strategies to improve frustration tolerance in children?
I think literature is coming up on mindfulness-based interventions in children. I'm not sure of how much the field has advanced, but I know there are a few studies that are coming up with it. It also has to do with regulation skills, emotion regulation skills, which has been talked about in children, and how parenting and other factors should be kept in mind when you're looking at building frustration tolerance. So it's not a one-off thing that you look at only one skill and not look at what other skills are deficient or present along with it. So I would be a little wary of saying just do this for low frustration tolerance and do something else for another problem. One has to take a holistic view. So you could probably look up literature on mindfulness, but that has been in the context of children with attention deficit hyperactivity. So there have been a few trials that have been published recently.
That was Dr. Indumati, and from
and neurofeedback also I think is now coming up, which is more self-regulatory in its mechanism.
There's another question from Dr. Kallol again. It was about providing a group intervention among adolescents or a one-to-one counseling for stress, which would be ideal.
To my knowledge, again, there is
both are ideal.
Both are dependent on your target group and what your aims are. A universal program, group interventions are more looked at. If the situation is something that is more specific to an individual, I would look at an individual. It's not one over the other, which is more relevant to the task at hand.
If there is very larger focus would be handled at a
Universal
group.
programs are preferably done in the larger way. So the general fare to an individual problem may not be very helpful and vice versa.